telling you, it's crazy. We lost power yesterday, and it's like ever since then, nothing wants to work right. And we actually even heard, as some people were coming in, that our friends up at Hopewell Baptist Church there on 601, they're completely without power this morning. So at least we're able to meet together, and we're able to come in here and have a good time. Kick off the new year together. So if you happen to miss last Sunday evening, I know that a few people actually came to church last Sunday morning and figured out, like, I bet you thought, oh my God, the rapture. Yeah. And I'm not going, So you're good. You're good. We're still here. We're going to kick off a new series today that we're calling Grace is Greater. And just to let you know, Grace is Greater is a book and a church resource series that was written and created by Kyle Idleman. Kyle is the teaching pastor at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And so just want to publicly say that we appreciate him and his team sharing this with us and our church so that we could take you through some of the ideas and the biblical teachings found here about this idea called grace. And now the staff and I, we went through this particular book together last summer after I came back off sabbatical, and we just thought it was just such a wonderful experience that it would be a great way to kick off the new year and to share these things with you guys. So we're going to jump right into this, and over the next few weeks, just talk about this idea, this word called grace. And now, at the beginning of every year, you might find that typically there is a list published of newly added words, like say to a dictionary, or there's a published list of words and phrases, they could even be slang, that are now considered acceptable. So if they're not even in a dictionary, so that you could use them in the game of Scrabble or something, you can at least use them in normal conversation and nobody will think you're weird. And so it's always fun to find that list and go through the words and see if before you read the definition, you can figure out what the word is supposed to mean. And so I've brought a few of those words here this morning, and we're going to read through them. The words always sort of tell a story. These new words tell a story about the year previous and sort of what culture was doing and where our minds were in that given year. And so I'm going to read through these, and we're going to find out the definitions, but you don't have to like shout it out or anything. You can participate in that way. But just think in your mind as you hear these words, like what each one means, and we'll just see how close you are. So the first one is phonesia. Phonesia. And so when you hear that, you think, well, maybe that has to do with like forgetting, putting your phone somewhere and forgetting where you put your phone. You got phonesia, which I do that all the time. Not just with my phone, with my keys, my wallet, everything. I mean, so, like, don't worry, I ain't got any money, so it doesn't matter if I find it or somebody else. But I do that stuff all the time. But phonesia is actually describing the act of dialing a phone number, and then before the person answers, you've forgotten who you called. We've all done that, haven't we? You call a friend, or even at work, you call a customer, or what. And before they answer, you're like, I don't remember who I was calling. And about that time, they pick up, hello? You're like, who is this? You called me. What's this all about? Like, what kind of game we're playing? So now that we know what that's called, the next time it happens, you can say, just please excuse me, I'm sorry. I've just got a case of phonesia and totally forgot who I was calling. It'll be okay. The next word is disconfect. Disconfect. This is one that you can teach your kids at Halloween. It might be helpful to them. But it describes what you do when you drop a piece of candy or something on the ground. We all live by the 5-second rule anyway. But when you pick that piece of candy or whatever it is up off the floor, off the ground, you blow on it, right? That's called disconfecting it. Like it's the attempt to sterilize whatever's been on the floor simply by blowing on it before you put it in your mouth. You're disconfecting it. So it's cool, all right? The next one, and maybe if you're in a corporate setting, you've participated in this, but you really didn't know what it was until today. It's called blamestorming. Blamestorming. So it describes a group of people sitting around. Let's say it's in a conference room, and there's problems in the company. And instead of sitting around trying to come up with solutions to those problems, you're trying to figure out who's responsible for them. Instead of brainstorming solutions, you're blame storming. Who is the cause of this? Who's the problem? Okay? So we've all probably sat in those kind of meetings, just didn't really know what to call what was going on. It's called blame storming. And then this last one, ladies, you're going to have to forgive me for it, but I just thought it was funny. It's called woman spreading, right? Like, oh my God, where is he going with this? Trust me, it's rated G. I'm not going to start the year off that way. But you might also think, well, all right, spreading, and so maybe we're talking about just the proliferation of the female population. There's just a lot more women than there are men. So maybe that's it. It's not, all right? It's very simple. Woman spreading describes the practice of most women, typically, say, on, like public transportation and sometimes in church, when you sit down in such a position as to take up more room than you need, and you put your stuff around you, and you begin to, encroach upon the seats beside you. That's called woman spreading, right? I know you're giving yourself like a little buffer, and you really don't want people sitting near you, but just know it makes things difficult for the rest of us, and sometimes it's irritating. All right, so no offense. I hope none's taken, none's intended. But these are just a few words, right, that maybe you work them into your vocabulary this year, maybe you don't. It's no big deal. It's all to prove this point. Even with familiar words, I think sometimes we have an issue with assuming that we know what they mean. Assuming what the correct use of a particular word is, how to interpret it, and how to apply it. And I think that's what happens a lot of times with the word grace. A lot of us has heard it. We sing about it. Pastors teach on it. We celebrate it. But many times we may assume that we know what it's all about, when in fact we don't. And so here's what I'm going to ask you to do over the next few weeks, is try, if you will, to clear your mind of any prior definition, explanation, or understanding of the word grace, so that we can approach it over the next 4 weeks as if we've never heard it before. As if hearing the word grace this morning is your very first time. Now, back in the early or late 80s, early 90s, the Kellogg's Company discovered through their research and their polling that there was a lot of people who used to eat their Kellogg's brand cornflakes. But over the years, as they grew into adulthood, they hadn't bought a box of those things in like years. And sales were beginning to show that. And so they wanted to reverse that course with this particular brand. So in the late 80s, early 90s, they came out with variations of one particular commercial as a marketing campaign. And so we ripped one of those off of YouTube this week and wanted to show it to you this morning. So watch this.
I got just 2 things to say about this cereal. Boring. It's too simple. These days you gotta add oats or straw or hay or something. This is nothing but flakes. Oh, all right, the taste is good. I'm kind of shocked that something as simple tastes this good. I think your simplicity angle will work after all. This cereal might just make it.
Kellogg's Cornflakes.
Cornflakes? Hey, can I pick a winner or what?
Taste them again for the first time.
So I realize in today's high-def TV kind of world, that sucked. Like really bad. You're thinking, we can do better than that. No, we can't. They made it, not us. So just understand, it's just all for, just to make a point. So forgive us for the quality of the video. The fact is, the message, what they were doing, the marketing sort of angle of that was brilliant. We know you've experienced this before. We know you've had these. And for whatever reason, like you've let it go or you've overlooked it, gotten tired of it, whatever that is, we want you to taste it again for the first time. That's genius. And it obviously worked for them because they're still selling a ton of them today. See, that's what I want us to do with grace. As we go through this series, I want us to taste it again for the first time. You see, the Bible says in Psalm 34, verse 8, taste and see. And I would add here, as if for the very first time, taste and see that the Lord is good. Listen, if you're sitting here this morning, like I said, we had a phenomenal first service. I expect nothing less here in this one and our third service. If you're sitting here and you've never experienced, you've never tasted the grace and the goodness of God, I'm going to ask you today to try it. Just try it. If you have, try it again. Taste it again and see how good God is. Listen, let's don't miss it. Let's don't miss the grace of God. Let's don't let it become something that sits on a shelf and becomes stale, and we miss the power of it. We forget the significance of God's wonderful grace. A verse that I would like for all of us really to work towards memorizing over the next 4 weeks. Very short. This is not going to be difficult at all. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. It might look a little different depending on the version of the Bible that you use, but let's try to remember this phrase. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. What a tragedy that would be, right? To miss the grace of God. Especially if you're sitting here and you're a part of our church, or you're a part of any community of believers, that you would miss out on the grace of God. Because, see, when you miss the grace of God, what we inevitably will do is substitute it with some cheap imitation. And when we do that, that will become toxic. That will prove itself to be deadly. And so I want us to hear and to understand the word grace this morning as if we've never heard it before. This is our first exposure. And to truly understand grace, there's 3 things we need to understand. First one is this. We first must understand that it means everyone needs it. We've got to understand everyone's need for grace. And now, do you know why? The number one reason why everybody needs grace, it's not very complicated. It's because everyone's a sinner. Every single one of us are messed up. And you can't talk about grace, you can't understand it, you can't embrace it without talking about and understanding sin. It's like trying to talk about Jesus being your personal Savior when you have no idea what He saves you from. Right? So I understand and know that there are some pastors and churches that sort of shy away from talking about sin. But listen, you can't talk about the grace of God unless you talk about sin. Both of them go hand in hand. They go together. And the Bible clearly doesn't shy away from the topic of sin. It points to sin and says, this is man's biggest and most basic problem. Romans chapter 3, verse 23 says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So according to the Bible, which would simply be another way of saying according to God, this is His Word, how many people since the beginning of the human race has sinned? How many? Yeah, I think all means all, right? Every single living person has sinned. And now think about that. How does that make you feel? The fact that everyone has sinned, including you, including me. See, when we really start to think about that, I'm a sinner. And somebody begins to push that on us and confront us with that fact, many times we'll start to think, well, yeah, I mean, I've sinned, but I haven't sinned. Like, and we're thinking in our mind the whole time of someone else and their sin that's worse than ours. And so we're comparing ourselves to other people and what they've done to make ourselves feel better about what we've done. You know what that's called? Pride. And pride is sin. You know? And in fact, it's listed among a very short list of things that God said He despises, that He hates. And so the pride it may be worse than whatever it is you're comparing yourself to, as if you're better. So let's just don't even go there this morning. Let's just own the fact that we're all sinners. We've all fallen short of God's standard. And now, accepting that, let's understand that the Bible often describes sin in the terms of sickness, as it's like it's a disease or a virus. And you might remember a few years ago, the whole Ebola virus scare. You remember that? Started in Africa and killed no telling how many people. And there were even a few Americans that contracted this disease, but it was all over the news. And the reason it was such a big deal is because this particular virus spread so easily, so quickly, and no one knew what the cure was. So in most cases, it was deadly. Well, that's the same way the Bible describes sin. It's like a virus that has been passed down and contracted by every single person since Adam. And it has spread to every living person. And now, whether it's Ebola, hopefully we don't come in contact with that, or it's the flu, or it's sin, when it comes to sickness, a lot of times we don't like to admit and acknowledge that we're sick. We would rather just go on about our day, go on with our life, denying it, as if that makes it better, right? We know that if we acknowledge that we're sick, we could go into work like coughing up a lung, and people saying, like, you don't look so good. You might need to take some rest, take some time off. Nah, I'm good. Nah, everything's okay. Because we fear, what we know is, if we acknowledge we're sick, then something has to change. We're going to have to do something different. We're going to have to go to the doctor. We may have to get some kind of prescription, some kind of medication. We might have to take a few days off, rearrange our schedule. Things become inconvenient. I don't have time to be sick. And so we just act as if we're not. But rarely does denying you're sick prove to be an effective remedy. Right? I mean, no one here has just simply, gotten over something just because they didn't want to admit that there was a problem. Sin is the very same way. Grace is the only cure. Grace is the only remedy. Refusing to admit that you are a sinner doesn't help. You're still sick. And without grace, this sin sickness will end in death every single time. And I'm not talking about just physical death. We're all going to face that one. But the Bible describes spiritual death, eternal death, an eternity of experiencing the judgment of God. So that's what happens without grace. But see, here's the good news. In Romans chapter 5, verse 17, we're told that for the sin of this one man, Adam, caused death to rule over many. It was passed down one to the other. But even greater, listen, if you're following along with me and taking notes, you got your Bible out, underline that, highlight that. But even greater is God's wonderful grace and His gift of righteousness. For all who receive it will live in triumph over sin and death through this one man, Jesus Christ. That is an awesome message. That we're all guilty of sin. But grace is greater. Grace is greater than our guilt. The wonderful grace of God is greater than our sin. I mean, let's go back several years, maybe quite a few years for some of us. You remember back in elementary school when you started learning the greater than, less than signs? Like, I loved those days in math. Easiest days ever. I wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer when it came to mathematics. But on the greater than, less than days, I could kill it. I would just show off because I knew greater than, less than. You see, we find that kind of equation right here in the Bible. Greater than and less than. The thing is, when grace is part of that equation, it's always the same. Grace is always greater. It could be your past, grace is greater. It could be whatever you're going through right now, your present circumstance. Grace is greater. It could be the shame and the guilt of whatever it is you know you've done that you wish you hadn't or you're denying. Grace is greater. It doesn't matter whatever you put on the other side of that equation. This is what I want you to leave with this morning. Whatever you put there, know this: grace is greater. We're all guilty, but God's wonderful grace is greater. It always outweighs our sin. And so we mentioned not missing the grace of God. Don't miss this. Romans 5:17 that we just read just said that the grace of God is a gift of righteousness. In other words, that grace is the means by which God makes us right with Him. He makes us right with God through His wonderful grace. And all who live in this grace live in victory. Live in victory over sin and over death. Yes, we've all sinned, but we can all be made right with God. We can all be given a brand new life because of grace. All right, so let's understand everyone's need for it. Another thing that we need to look at, if we're going to understand grace as if it's for the first time this morning, is the effects of its absence. In other words, what does it look like if grace isn't around? If you take grace out of the mix, what do you have when you talk about God and you leave grace out of the conversation? Here's what you have: religion. You talk about God, you take grace out, what you're left with is religion. And here's something we need to understand about Jesus. He proved this in His ministry. He didn't really like religion and religious people. And I've grown to be somewhat unfond of them myself. And it's not because of people, all right? Don't get me wrong. It's simply because religion is man's attempt to earn God's favor by adhering to a set of rules or regulations or rituals. And Jesus, He would have nothing to do with that because it takes the grace of God out of the equation. And the problem with that is, unlike grace, religion is not greater than our sin. Religion is not greater than our guilt. Therefore, religion cannot save us. It's the idea that if we can be good enough, and if we can toe the line, that maybe we will tip the moral scale into our favor. But the truth is that all the rule keeping in the world, all the rituals, all the good behavior, all of those attempts will never be greater than our sin. Religion is like if you did actually have the flu and you went to work, cold chills, 104-degree temperature and all, thinking that you could just work through it. I'm not sick. Listen, that's not going to work. That's going to prove to be a problem for you. Well, religion is the number one way that people who are sin sick try to deny their sickness. And it's an ineffective method. It'll never work. Because when you set religion and grace and you compare the two, you'll find they have some drastic differences. Religion, it has a favorite word. Actually two, because they're similar. Religion's favorite word is do. And its sibling, don't. Do this and don't do that. In other words, there are certain behaviors, certain actions that you do that will cause you to progress, that will make you better. And then there are other behaviors and other actions that if you do those, then you would digress. Right? You're worse off. If you toe the line, then maybe you can make the cut and get into heaven. That's religion for you. Grace, it has a different favorite word. It's not do, it's not don't. Grace's favorite word is done. Because it's all about what Jesus Christ has done for us. The death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's all there is to talk about. What Jesus has done. What's done for us, not what's done by us. It's not about our performance. Okay? Another stark difference that you'll see if you examine the two is that religion tends to be outward focused. It's all about what others see, what other people think, which again is just, a manifestation of this do-don't mentality. Grace is totally the opposite. Grace is inward focused. It focuses on the heart because grace knows that true, lasting transformation in your life takes place on the inside and then works its way out. It's not something that starts on the outside and works itself in. It's totally opposite. And so that's why religion majors on rules, grace majors on a relationship. Religion is all about what you do. Grace is all about what Jesus did. You see the difference there? And let's not forget, one of the primary motivations for religion, shame and control. If religion and religious people can shame you, guilt you, make you feel bad enough about yourself, they can control you. They can make you do whatever they want you to do, say whatever they want you to say, believe whatever they want you to believe. Grace is the opposite. The motivation behind grace is gratitude that leads to surrender. Grace knows that if we truly understand, if we really comprehend what Jesus did for us there on the cross, out of gratitude, we will gladly surrender our lives to Him. Nobody will have to make us do anything. We will give ourselves to Him. You say that's major, major differences. And so here's what we're left with this morning. Two choices. One, you can continue your life in religion, trying to do all the right things, trying to live the right way, and get everything just so, but always sort of feeling frustrated, disappointed, as if you're coming up short. Or you can forget all of that today and you can try grace. And you can discover what it really feels like to be free. Try it as if for the first time. Everyone needs it. There's some seriously negative effects when it's not around, when it's absent. And the third thing that we need to understand about grace is that you must experience it, not just explain it. If you really want to know what grace is all about, you have to experience it. I wish so badly that through my preaching, you would just get it. Like you would know it, okay? And if it weren't my preaching, that it would be someone else's. I don't care. Just as long as you get it and understand it. But here's what I think the Bible teaches, what I've come to discover even in my own life, that truly understanding grace doesn't come through exposition, doesn't come through explanation, it comes through experience. First-hand experience. And Jesus, being the author of grace, He knew that better than anybody else. Something interesting that proves that is, the Apostle Paul, he's great. God used him to write nearly 2/3 of the New Testament. The Apostle Paul used the word grace over 100 times in his letters. You know how many times Jesus in His teaching and preaching used the word grace? 0. Jesus never once used the word grace. But I double dog dare you to read the Gospels and tell me it's not there. It's undeniable in the ministry of Jesus. Grace is there. But He didn't have to talk about it because He knew it was better off experienced than explained. If you have trouble believing that this morning, I would challenge you this week to open your Bible to John chapter 8 and ask the woman in that story about grace. You see, Jesus was teaching. It was early one morning, and disrupting His whole flow. I'm sure He was like right in the middle of something really good. Here come this group of religious leaders. They were pushing and shoving this woman in front of them. Likely she was in nothing more than a bedsheet. And they push her to the ground right there in front of everybody. And they said, Jesus, we just caught this woman in the act of adultery. Now the law says, right? Religion says, the rules say, she must be stoned to death. We're curious as to what you say. All right, so he knew that they were trying to trap him, trying to back him into a corner. And so he just kept quiet for a minute. We're told that he knelt down and he wrote something in the dirt on the ground, and we don't even know what that is. And after a few awkward moments, they're all like, well, I mean, are you going to say anything? What do you have to say about this? He stands up, he looks around, and he says, okay, how about this? How about the one standing here who has no sin, who's guilty of nothing? Let that person throw the first stone. Let them be the first, and then the rest of us will follow suit. And I mean, you could hear a pin drop, I'm sure. And they're all looking around at each other, waiting for somebody to step forward to volunteer. But nobody does. Why? Because we're all guilty. One by one, they drop their rocks and they walk away until nobody's there. Jesus goes back to this woman. He kneels down beside her and he says, ma'am, where are your accusers? Is there nobody here to condemn you? And maybe for the first time since she had been shoved to the ground, she looks up. And she says, no, there's nobody. There's nobody here. And Jesus says, well, neither do I condemn you. Now go and leave your life of sin. What an amazing display of grace. That's grace. That is undeniable. And here's the thing. Jesus knew this woman. He knew her better than anybody there. In fact, He knew her better than she knew herself because He created her. And He knew she was guilty. He never denied her guilt. It really irritates me when I hear people read this and suggest that perhaps Jesus gave her a pass. No, He didn't. He said nothing about denying her sin. In fact, He called it out. He said, don't sin anymore. Get rid of this. But He displayed grace. Listen, this was the worst day of her life. Could you imagine that? Her deepest, darkest secret displayed in public for everybody to know, for everybody to see. But I have to believe this morning that maybe we get this opportunity to ask her one day, like, would you do anything? Would you have that day be any different? Like, how embarrassing that would have been, right? I just feel like that she would probably respond to us like, yeah, it was pretty rough, but I would have it no other way. You know why? Because the worst day of her life became her best. When in her sin, in her shame, in her guilt, she came face to face with grace. See, some of us need to experience that today. Listen, there are probably plenty of us in here who have secrets. We have things that we're holding on to. We've got sin that we're just clinging to. There's things that are in the dark places of our life. Listen, they need to be drug out into the light, kicking and screaming today. Because I guarantee you this, if you will do that, just like this lady here, it will be met with grace. It can be one of the scariest moments of your life. But listen, hanging on to it and hiding it is an ineffective cure for your sin. It must be exposed so that grace can prove to be greater. So with every head bowed and every eye